Hey, everybody.
Hello.
Say, what was this big conflict that Jesus was having with everybody over the Sabbath? Today we're going to explore what that was all about and come to a greater understanding of both Jesus' point of view and the point of view of the Pharisees that were opposing him. Here we go. Okay, so last time we were talking about Jesus' ministry down by the Sea of Galilee and some of the events that took place there with him preaching in the boat. Remember, we've talked about how he pushed out a little bit from the shore just so people could hear him better. And some of the miracles that he did there. Well, later on, we come to an event which is really a focus of Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees. And let's start that out in Luke chapter 6, verse 1. Karen, would you read that for us?
Now it happened on a Sabbath that he was passing through a grain field, and his disciples were plucking and eating the ears of grain, rubbing them with their hands.
Okay, good. And what's the question?
Why were they rubbing the grain in their hands?
Yeah, what was that all about?
Well, when the grain grows and the kernels are in the head of the grain, you can put it between your hands and you rub your hands together and it will separate the chaff from the grain.
Right, it pops out from the little husks, and then you have those little kernels, and then you can eat those kernels. You can just eat them just like they are. It's kind of like a snack that you can have if you're really hungry. And that's what they were doing. They're having a little snack as they walked along the way. Okay, what's the second question?
Did they have the owner's permission?
Wow, that just says they're walking through somebody's grain field. It doesn't sound like they knew who it was or that the person was there. How did that work?
And that day, it was perfectly acceptable for somebody to take a little grain from the field. You just can't carry it away.
Right, well, not only that, it's mentioned in the Bible. Deuteronomy 23 verse 26 says, "When you go into the standing grain of your neighbor, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you will not swing a sickle on the standing grain of your neighbor." So in other words, you're allowed to take a little snack, but you can't start harvesting and taking it home with you. So a little snack is okay, taking a lot is not okay. And that's still the attitude in that part of the world until today. You're allowed to do that. You can take a little snack along the way. A good example is when you go into the marketplace in Israel, you can always taste the produce before you buy it. And it's perfectly okay. That's just the normal way of doing things there. Okay, let's continue the next verse.
But certain of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not permitted on Sabbaths?"
Well, wait a minute. Why did they say that? Does the Bible say that this is forbidden to do on the Sabbaths?
It says you shouldn't do any work.
Yeah, but we're talking about just taking a little snack, right? It's not like a job.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's continue. Verse 3.
And Jesus answered them and said, "Didn't you read this that David did when he was hungry and those with him?
Continue.
How he entered into the house of God, and having taken the loaves of the bread of presentation, he ate and gave them to those with him, which is not permitted to eat except for the priests alone."
Okay, so this bread of presentation is the bread that was there in the sanctuary, the holy place, before the Lord, along with the lampstand and the incense altar. So this was one of the holy things that went into the temple there. Here it's telling us, reminding us of the story when this bread was given to David and his men. Now, David was not a priest, his men were not priests, and they ate it. So why was this permitted? Well, first of all, let's ask the other question. Where does it say this is not permitted? And that's in Leviticus 24 verse 9, where it tells us about this bread of the presence that we're talking about. It will be for Aaron and his sons, and they will eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him, from the offerings by fire of the Lord, an eternal statute. So it specifically says in the law of God that this was for the priests to eat. And the question?
So why were David and his men permitted to eat it?
Yeah, how did that work? Well, we can refer to this verse in Leviticus 18, verse 5, and this is a verse that the rabbis would often bring up in a situation like this. It says, "You will keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man will do them, he will live by them. I am the Lord." And the rabbis understood that when it says he will live by them, it's implying that he will not die by them. In other words, that it will be towards the benefit of your life. And so if there's some situation which is threatening your life, you are allowed to break most of the laws to save your life. And this is an official doctrine of the rabbis called pikuach nefesh, saving a life. Almost all of the law, not the very big laws, you cannot do this in the case of adultery or murder or idolatry, but otherwise you could break a law of Moses in order to save a life. And this is still the teaching right up until today. So what's the follow-up question?
So why did this make it okay for David and his men to eat the bread? Hint, some laws overrule others. So it was saving David and his men's life.
But were they really going to die if they didn't eat this bread?
They were hungry.
Well, what it was is a very liberal application of this teaching of saving a life. And in fact, that was often done. You're supposed to treat it very generously, right? Even if there's a little possibility that somebody's life might be in danger, you could apply this principle. What this tells us is that there are some laws in the Bible which sometimes override other laws. Now, for people who live within that legal system, this is a necessity. You can't really make the system function unless you do that. And that's exactly what's going on here. And this is a common thing within the law, that some laws are more important. They will override other laws. And that's what's going on here. The law about saving a life overrules that teaching that the bread was to be for the priests. Okay, let's continue to the next verse.
And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Well, what does that mean? Who's the Son of Man?
Jesus.
Well, it's certainly true that Jesus used this title for himself, the Son of Man, but it can also just mean a person in general. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Here, when Jesus says that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, it could just mean that the Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And this is something he actually said in this same encounter with the Pharisees, according to Mark chapter 2, verse 27. But was Jesus also implying something more than this? Matthew gives us a hint that he was. In Matthew 12, verse 6, again, in this same encounter with the Pharisees, he said, "But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here." Well, what does that mean? It means that in the same way that the law of mercy overrode the law about the bread for David and his men, Jesus' ministry overrides the law about the Sabbath. So when he says that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he's also saying that the requirements of gospel ministry override the law of the Sabbath. Well, anyway, what's our follow-up question?
So why does this mean it was okay for his disciples to eat the grain?
Right, why does saying that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath mean it was okay for them to eat the grain? Well, like I just said, remember, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And this is a teaching that later we actually hear rabbis saying after the time of Jesus, shortly after the time of Jesus. And so that's what it's telling us. Okay, let's continue.
Now it happened on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught. And there was a man there, and his right hand was withered. But the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find grounds to accuse him.
Okay, so they're watching out that he might heal on the Sabbath, but why would this be a problem?
Did they consider that work?
Yeah, because this is one of the things they considered work, along with many other things. Well, here's the verse in Exodus. Karen, would you read that?
And the seventh day is a Sabbath for the Lord your God. You will not do any work, you and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant and your animal and your stranger that is within your gates.
Okay, so really the question comes down to, what does work mean? How do you interpret this word? Well, the rabbis decided to tackle this question, and they came up with a very specific definition of exactly what constitutes work. So they made a list of 40 minus 1, 39 different classes of work. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, planting crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, and on and on and on it goes. So they made it very specific what you are and are not allowed to do on the Sabbath. Of course, this was their interpretation. It's not what the Bible itself says. The Bible just uses that word work which could also refer to business type of work, but this is how they understood it at the time of Jesus and right up until today. So let's try to understand their point of view a little bit. In the time of Jesus, the rabbis were arguing about this point. Can you eat an egg laid by a chicken on the Sabbath? And their determination was, no, you cannot. And the question is, why? And the answer was because you didn't prepare it in advance to be eaten on that Sabbath. Now that sounds really strange to us, but this is what they were teaching. Or what about if you wanted to spit on the Sabbath? You are allowed to spit on a rock, but you're not allowed to spit on the dirt. Well, why would that be? Because if you spit on the dirt, it would make a little impression, and that would be like plowing. So that was forbidden. Or another thing they were talking about is if your house was burning down, you were not allowed to go in and carry out your things. But if you went in during the fire and you, let's say, were wanting to take your clothes out and you simply put the clothes on, one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top, so you're wearing all these clothes, that was okay, because it's not forbidden to wear clothes on the Sabbath. So you couldn't carry them, but you could wear them out. And even today, if somebody's really very, very strict about this topic, they will tear their toilet paper the day before the Sabbath so they won't have to tear it on the Sabbath. Why? Because tearing is understood to be one of those things you're not allowed to do. So it comes to some very extreme positions, certainly as far as we think of today, those of us who are not Jewish, but that's just the way it was. They had another thing called the Sabbath day's journey, and that's as far as you were allowed to walk on a Sabbath day. If you walked anything more than that, it was considered work. And this is even mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 12. It says they returned to Jerusalem from the Mount called of the Olives, that's the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. So you can see there in the picture, the mountain in the background is Mount of Olives, and in the foreground, you can see the Dome of the Rock there and a few other buildings in Jerusalem itself. So just across this small valley, that's the distance of a Sabbath day's journey. So some people are really puzzled about this. You're not allowed to do so many things. One of them is that you're not allowed to make a fire on the Sabbath, and that is a biblical rule. And this gets applied into something like using an elevator. How do you go up on an elevator if you're not allowed to press the button? Because pressing the button activates a little electrical spark, you could say, and that they connect to making a fire on the Sabbath, so you're not allowed to do it. So how do people get to their apartments when they're way up in a building on the Sabbath? Well, they have something called a Sabbath elevator, a Shabbat elevator, and what happens is that that elevator automatically stops at all the floors, and that way you don't have to press any button, and then you get to your apartment. It takes a little bit longer, but it works. Here's another issue. The rabbi said you are not allowed to gargle vinegar to relieve tooth pain. I don't know if you've ever experienced that yourself, but one way to deal with tooth pain is to take some vinegar into your mouth and gargle it around, swish it around, and then spit it out. And they said this is not permitted on the Sabbath because that's medical work, and work is forbidden on the Sabbath. Of course, there were ways around some of these things. For example, if you took that vinegar into your mouth, you swished it around, and then you swallowed it, okay, no problem. It's not forbidden to eat on the Sabbath. But you weren't allowed to swish it around, spit it out, because that was considered medical work. Our boss, when we were working in Jerusalem, used to tell a story about how a man in the synagogue, the rabbi, was at the front, during the Shabbat morning, the Sabbath morning worship service, and he started to convulse, and it looked like he was having a heart attack or something. So the people got very worried and concerned about that, and they sent somebody to the back of the synagogue to call the doctor. Now, normally, using the phone on the Sabbath is not permitted because it's activating something electrical, so that's not allowed, except in this case, since the man's life looked like it could be in danger, they were allowed to make the phone call, because you're allowed to break the Sabbath laws in order to save a life. I actually talked to a guy who did this one time, and he said, I was so excited I had never used the phone on the Sabbath before. Well, anyway, so he made the call, and the doctor said, okay, I'll be there, and he came in the ambulance, ding, 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 down to the synagogue. And while he was doing that, the men of the synagogue went out and removed the barricades in the street in front of the synagogue. A lot of the synagogues will put up like a police barrier type of barricade so that nobody maybe who's not Jewish or is not observant, will drive past the synagogue during the worship service on Shabbat. But now they needed to make a way for the ambulance to get in there, and they were allowed to move those barriers because they were saving a life. Otherwise, they would have waited until the Sabbath was over. Well, here comes the ambulance, drives up to the front of the synagogue, and the doctor gets out, and the people bring him in. He's in here, doctor. They bring him into this synagogue. They show him the rabbi, and the doctor looks him over. And after a while, he looks up and says, well, I've got some good news for you. It wasn't a heart attack. It was just a heartburn. Just give him this medicine, and he'll be okay. And they said, oh, thank you so much, doctor, for coming. We're so sorry to bother you on the Sabbath. And they were talking to him as they walked with him out to the front of the synagogue again. Once they got there, the men of the synagogue stood in a circle around the ambulance and wouldn't let it drive away. Why was that? Because no longer saving a life. And so the doctor had to walk all the way back to the hospital. Okay, so that's just some examples to give us some insight into what the views about Sabbath were and are today that created the conflict with Jesus. Well, let's continue in Luke 6, verse 8, Karen.
Now he had known what they were reasoning about. But he said to the man who had the withered hand, get up and stand in the middle. And having gotten up, he stood there. Then Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it permitted on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to destroy it?
And the question?
Why would it be evil if you didn't heal the man?
Right, because isn't that what he's implying? He says, is it permitted on the Sabbath to do good or to do so? Good would be to heal the man. To do evil, he implies, would be not to heal the man. Why would that be evil if he didn't heal the man?
He's not doing a good thing that he could do.
Right. You're omitting doing a good thing that you could do. You're omitting doing good. So if you don't do a good that you can do, that would be something bad. That would be something evil. Okay, good. Next verse.
And having looked around at all of them, he said to him, stretch out your hand. Then he did, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and were discussing with each other what they might do to Jesus.
Yeah, they were pretty angry about it. Why? Why were they so angry?
Because he did something on the Sabbath.
Specifically disobeying their interpretation of what was permitted and what was not permitted on the Sabbath. Now remember, it was their interpretation. The Bible only says work. It doesn't define what that work means. And so they had different interpretations of what was permitted and what was not permitted on the Sabbath. Okay, verse 12.
Now it happened in these days that he went out to the mountain to pray, and he was spending the whole night in prayer to God.
So here again we see Jesus taking the time to pray privately to the Father, exactly the kind of thing that he instructs us to do. And the next verse.
And when day came, he called his disciples to him, and having chosen from them 12, these he also named apostles.
Okay, good. The question?
What does apostle mean?
Now, what does apostle mean? Well, actually, the English word apostle comes from the Greek root, which is a very similar sounding word, and it simply means somebody who is sent out. This is not something that was unique to Jesus. The rabbis also would send out apostles, or you could translate it as emissaries, who would go to different Jewish communities at certain times during the year to alert them as to the proper time for the festivals to be celebrated. This all traced back to the timing of the month. Nowadays we just look at a calendar, it's all done mathematically. But back in those days, you had to actually observe the new moon. So somebody had to observe it, they had to report it to the temple, it had to be approved, and then this information was sent out to Jewish communities all over the world, so everybody would be celebrating the festivals at the same time. And so they would also take with them other rulings that had been made by the religious authorities. Well, Jesus was preparing his apostles to have the same kind of a function, that at the right time, they would be sent out to bring his message of the kingdom to the world. And we have a follow-up question there. What is that?
Why 12?
Yeah, why did he choose 12 apostles? Why not some other number?
There were 12 tribes of Israel.
Right. He connected it at one point to the 12 tribes of Israel. he said that you will be judging over the 12 tribes when he was talking to his apostles. So that was clearly the connection there. Okay, good. The next verse.
Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus. Is that how you say that name?
Alphaeus.
Alphaeus, and Simon, the one called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor.
So the question?
Who were these men, and what do we know about them?
Right, what do we know about the apostles? Well, here's a few questions just to help us think over who they were. And the first one, they were all from Galilee except one. Who was that?
Judas.
Right, Judas. As far as we know, we don't know all the details, but as far as we can figure it out, Judas Iscariot, his name Iscariot seems to mean from a little village that was down in Judah. So he seems to be the only one that was not from Galilee. And what about the next question? 6 were from small villages by the Sea of Galilee. Who were those 6 people? Who were those 6 disciples?
Peter and his brother Andrew.
Right.
James and John.
Right.
And who else?
If you remember, Philip was from the same village that Peter and Andrew were from. And there was also Matthew, who was a tax collector in Capernaum, which is right by the Sea of Galilee. Okay, good. And the next question, 4 were fishermen. Who were the 4 fishermen?
Peter and his brother Andrew.
Right.
And James and his brother John.
Right, those 4 we know. Maybe others were fishermen, but those are the 4 that we know were fishermen. And who is the one who had been a tax collector?
That one's easy, Matthew.
Right. And who had been a zealot? One of those zealot people who wanted to fight against the Romans.
What's his name, Simon? Simon the Zealot?
Right, he had Simon the Zealot was one of his disciples. And here's the last question. Who was a twin?
And John somebody. Was it John?
No, it's Thomas.
Thomas.
Thomas is called Didymus, which simply means the twin. And that's in John 11, verse 16. So here's your answers. All were from Galilee except Judas. Now there's the 6 from the Sea of Galilee. Now, Judas' name was actually Judah. When it comes over into Greek, it becomes Judas, and that's how it comes into English. But he would have been called Judah. Peter, of course, had the name Shimon, Simon, and Cephas. James, his name actually is Jacob. It's kind of a story behind how that got switched over to James, but actually it was Jacob. And Matthew, we see down there, he was also known as Levi. And so here's our answers. But we got one last question. What's the question there?
Why was this a very strange group of disciples?
Yeah, why would the people have seen Jesus traveling around with these people have thought that they're kind of unusual?
Did other people have fishermen for their disciples?
Yeah, the fishermen were not the normal people to follow a rabbi around. Following a rabbi around was kind of like graduate school. You did your elementary school in the synagogue, and then if you were an advanced pupil, you would go down to Jerusalem and you would study with a rabbi. And so, you had a certain kind of person that would be attracted to this kind of thing, that would be able to do it. But these were really ordinary people. These were not those, intellectuals who would normally be following a rabbi around. They were just ordinary people. And so looking at this group, people would have thought, wow, that's an unusual group. This is not the normal group of people to be following a rabbi around. Okay, that's it. So be sure to join us next time. We're going to be talking about Jesus' most important sermon, what's called in Matthew the Sermon on the Mount, in Luke called the Sermon on the Plain. So I hope we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.